Reverbs are about two things, either placing a sound within a space or sound design. Many people think with a reverb, you're just using it to make things big, but that's simply not the case. So without further ado, let's get started. Please smash that like button and subscribe. So I have loaded up a preset in Valhalla Vintage Verb on some vocals. And the first thing we're going to talk about here is early reflections. These early reflections are the first reflections in a reverb that come back to you. Much like a bat using their version of sonar, this tells you the size and dimensions of a space that your source sound is within. So in order to show you what a drastic difference in early reflections would be like, I've opened an instance of our verb instead of the Valhalla Vintage Verb. Here, we'll see we have a early reflections option where we can actually turn the early reflections all the way down. So now if we use our critical thinking and early reflections tell us what the room size is like, what happens if we remove them all together?
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind. Keep on searching for the...
Let's turn this reverb up so it'll be more dramatic.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind.
And then we'll bring the early reflections back in.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind. Keep on searching for...
And then we'll A-B. No reflections.
Hey baby, no, never mind.
With reflections.
Hey baby, no, never mind.
And if you listen closely, you should have been able to hear the definition of our room, leave, and come back with the reduction and the adding of our early reflections. Now thinking about the idea of putting our source sound within a space, early reflections create some realism and create a place for that sound to exist. If you were just trying to create a wash or an effect, this would be something that you might not worry about as much or might decide to opt out of entirely. The next thing we'll look at here is our diffusion. Diffusion is going to be the difference between having a square parallel room and having that same room, but with bookcases, beds, and all kinds of other stuff that's going to reflect the sound in multiple different directions. With less diffusion, we have a more boxy sound that creates more frequency buildup and is a bit more modal. Rather than with diffusion, we get more of a wash with less frequency buildup and a smoother sounding room. So we'll listen to it without any diffusion, and then we'll listen to it 100% diffusion.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind.
100%.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind.
A-B a couple times.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind. Keep on searching for the telltale signs. And baby, it points back to you. And baby, what would you do, yeah, if you didn't have those things you love?
Now, if we go back and look at our Valhalla Vintage Verb here, we'll realize that we have an option for diffusion between early reflections and late reflections. Now, the more we diffuse our early reflections, the more chaotic and the less straightforward and defined our space is going to be, which might not necessarily be perfect for placing somebody within a space. It can still achieve this effect, but it definitely pushes more towards effects and sound design. And when I say there's two uses for a reverb, either creating a space or creating an effect, these are the kind of decisions and kind of things you're going to have to keep in mind when making these choices so that you can stay on track to achieving the final result that you want. Which way do you want to push it? What's your purpose for the reverb? Do you want to shape a room and make it more acoustically defined? Or do you want to push the edges of realism and create an effect? It's up to you. Now, next, we're going to remove the late reflections completely. But first, let's have a listen with diffusing the early reflections and the early reflections alone.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind. Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind.
Now, when you're listening to this, I want you to listen to the word behind. With our early reflections not diffused, it'll sound more boxy. With it completely diffused, that boxiness will go away.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind. Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind.
Now, though, let's go back to our R verb and completely take away the reverb, but leave the early reflections.
Hey baby, no, never mind.
We'll turn this up.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind.
Now what we got there is we got some room definition without the reverb. Now, this is very really unrealistic, if that makes sense. Because what I have going on right now is I have a very small room size where I'm only getting early reflections, which is giving me the shape of the room, which is a small room size. But after those early reflections, it is an extremely absorptive room because nothing else is coming back to me. This wouldn't really happen like that in real life. And humans don't like absorptive, quiet rooms. If you've heard about the quiet room where they made it absorb as much sound as possible, it makes people freak out. It's not normal. But this is a great technique for placing drums or other things like that in a room without having the tail of the reverb in there to muddy things up. And there we are. We added a little bit of the tail of the reverb back to bring it just a little bit closer to reality, but we still just mainly have the early reflections defining the room. Now, what if we pushed it to the extreme the other way? What if we lengthened the tail and boosted the tail of the reverb and then took out our early reflections? We'll shorten our pre-delay and give it a listen.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind. Keep on searching for the telltale signs.
And that is something way closer to an effect. That's something I could probably sample the end of and use for a riser or something like that. Pretty cool. Now, our next option for shaping a room acoustically is sound damping. If we look over here in the left of our verb, we can move up and down what is the reflectiveness of our room for different frequency content in different areas. If I open Valhalla Vintage verb back up, we can see we've got a cutoff here with the high shelf. If I boost this, I'll get more reflections in the high end, as well as a cutoff for the bass frequency, where I have a bass multiplier, which will either rise or cut off the bass frequencies. These settings mimic the amount of absorption in a room. To make this more obvious, I'll throw one right onto the vocal track and we'll go purely wet. And that should have been a lot clearer. And with these controls, you can either push reflectiveness or mimic a highly absorptive room. Again, what are you going for? The choice is yours.
Hey baby, no, never mind. Don't leave yourself behind. Keep on searching.
Now, if you've made it this far, you should be able to see how creating an effect or creating a room are two things that can sometimes be almost the same or be completely different. You can stay in the boundaries with something realistic, or you can push reality. Much like anything music related, the choices are subjective. And one thing that somebody will choose for a reverb might not feel specifically right for yours. And because of this, I can't build a room for you. I can only show you how to build a room or effect by helping give you an understanding of how these controls might relate to real life. With this understanding, though, hopefully you can take your reverb application to the next level. Something else to consider is that reverb types are very important to the application. Each type of reverb that's either going to recreate a mechanical reverb like a spring or a plate, or recreate something like a concert hall versus a room, are all going to have a different starting basis and starting point for the initial values for all of these controls. That, however, is a whole topic in itself. And if you want to learn, click the video above. But that just about covers it. And today you learned how to use damping effects, diffusion, as well as early and late reflections to help depict your room size as well as your room shape, or take you out of that room and push you to the boundaries of realism to create an effect. And now knowing these things, use that reverb to create a space for your mix or to create cool effects for any occasion. If you like this video, please like this video. If you have any comments, please comment. I always appreciate a subscribe. It's Warren with Scale Audio, and adios.